Good afternoon, everybody. We want to welcome you to the Rethinking Philanthropy and its Role in the Food System webinar. My name is Ann Palmer. I'm a Director of Practice at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, and I work on a project called Food Policy Networks with my colleagues Karen Bassarab and Ali Weiner, and Noel Didla is also one of our collaborators on that activity, as is Jane Schmitz. And we are really happy to welcome you all here today. I'm going to be introducing everybody on the webinar, and then I'm going to turn it over to Noel Didla, who will be facilitating. I personally am really looking forward to hearing some inspirational words today after the last couple days, so I'll start with that. Noel is an immigrant from the Global South, making a home in the Deep South. She's the co-steward of the Center for Mississippi Food Systems, which is a statewide hub that nurtures and builds food system thinkers and leaders through the Mississippi Food Systems Leadership Institute. They strengthen the collective power of advocacy through Mississippi's Food Justice Collaborative and inform and transform institutional and public policy through the Mississippi Food Policy Council. She is the co-steward of the Deep South Solidarity Fund, an emergent giving space that focuses on funding BIPOC individuals, communities, and infrastructure development in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. We have Jed Oppenheim. Jed is currently a foundation program director focusing on criminal legal reform. Previously, he was at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation supporting community-led transformation efforts around education, family economic security, maternal and child health, and food systems. At Kellogg, Jed supported communities throughout Mississippi and New Orleans. Prior to that, he focused on education and youth justice, working to end the school-to-prison pipeline in Mississippi, primarily with the Southern Poverty Law Center. He also served on the Jackson Public School District Board of Trustees for almost 4 years. We're also welcoming Jane Schmitz. Jane's the director of the From Now On Fund, which seeks to reduce systemic inequities in health and well-being outcomes in the U.S. Before working in philanthropy, Jane taught public health at Occidental College from 2011 to 2019. She serves on the board for Center in the Science in the Public Interest and has a doctoral degree in public health from the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Jane started the Better Food Policy Fund, which awarded $30,000 of unrestricted funds to 10 U.S. food-based food policy councils in 2024, with another $30,000 going to those same groups in 2025. And then finally, we are welcoming Brenda Solórzano. Brenda is currently the head of the California Endowment. She was the founding CEO of the Headwaters Foundation in Montana, and during her tenure at Headwaters, Brenda worked from the ground up to build an institution for the community by the community. She's a nationally recognized leader in trust-based philanthropy, a values-driven approach that advances equity, shifts power, and builds mutually accountable relationships between funders and nonprofits. She began her career in advocacy circles and has continued to ensure that community voice remains at the center of informing her philanthropic work. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Noel.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on rethinking philanthropy and its role in food systems. I want to thank the leaders and stewards at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Livable Future for this opportunity to bring us all together. We are coming together right after the US elections, and a lot of us are holding so much of feelings in our hearts and in our bodies. We are carrying a lot in our bodies. I want to acknowledge that in this moment. I want to honor where we all are in our journeys to be who we are and to continue to do the work that we do. And as we are carrying these feelings in our bodies, I want to also, encourage all of us to think about ways in which we can learn to embody care, embody love, and embody being grounded and centered in us, the work that brings us, the purpose of who we are, so that we can move from places of care, right? Because we are going to need a lot more care than ever before to continue this journey of being warriors for justice, right? So I want to acknowledge that in this moment. Welcome you all. And in chat, if you can all share your name, preferred gender pronouns, where you are showing up from, the ancestral lands where you're making home, it would be great. And I'm going to model that for you. Noel Didla, she, her pronouns. And I am making Jackson, Mississippi home, been making Jackson, Mississippi home for the past 22 years. And these lands are the lands of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Natchez, and many other indigenous peoples. And this is also the land that has been built on the backs of enslaved African people and continues to be the economy of this state continues to be built based on the exploited and extracted labor of immigrant communities. So just sharing that, and whatever you're moved to share in terms of your name, preferred gender pronoun, and the ancestral lands you're calling home, and organizational representation, that'll be great so that we can all continue to build with each other via chat. Also, through the conversations. So I'm going to give us all like a couple of minutes to place our comments in chat. And also want to welcome again our panelists who agreed to be here with us to share their stories, bear witness to their learning so that we could all continue to understand what kind of role we think philanthropy should hold in transforming food systems, and why should the role absolutely look different given where we are, right? And hear from experiments that have been going on, learnings that have been taking shape. So very glad to see some familiar names in the chat. Hello, Kalia, Allison, hi. And the rest of you that I don't know, also hello, everyone. And welcome again. Hey, Ryan, big up to people joining from Mississippi. All right, as folk are joining and sharing, I want to continue because we are only here together for the next 50 minutes. So I want to make sure that we make best use of this time. We all know what philanthropy is, kind of, right? The definition is the desire to promote the welfare of others, expressed especially by the generous donations of money for a good cause. And that is kind of like the traditional definition of philanthropy. And philanthropy in the United States has a long history, and out of philanthropy, a lot of things have come about. And as we understand, philanthropy, like any other space, has had its ups and has had its downs. It has caused tremendous amount of brought in tremendous amounts of opportunities. And then there's been harms that have also come out of the way philanthropy has been done, right? Philanthropy allowed for educational institutions to be established. Philanthropy has allowed for communities to have access to assistances. Philanthropy has allowed for social movements to continue to grow on the good side, right? When you think about philanthropy, and how philanthropy has caused harm, it's the inequities that come to mind in terms of how philanthropy has shaped the continuation of inequities. And so there's a lot that has happened in the world of philanthropy. We are not trying to examine philanthropy as a whole right now, but through the three stories we are going to hear, what we are trying to do is understand how these individuals, through their positions of leadership and through their personal values and bringing their values into practice, have been able to help us to understand philanthropy in a different way, right? So I'm gonna invite Brenda, Jane, and Jed into this conversation. Whoever feels moved to start, please start. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. There are a couple of questions that I want to give you. And before I give you the questions, I want to ground us. in this moment by offering a quote by Edgar Villanova. And this quote is from Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. And that is, the lesson is that thriving is not actually about the leader, it's about the whole flock. Everyone has the potential to lead, and leadership is about listening and being attuned to everyone else. It's about flexibility. It's about humility. It's about trust. It's about having fun along the way. It is more about holding space for others' brilliance than being the sole source of answers, more about flexible shape shifting to meet the oncoming challenges than holding fast to a 5-year strategic plan. I just felt moved to offer that because of what that represents as we all sit with what this next 4 years are going to look like. So the questions I have for you all right now is, we all heard your brilliant introductions from Anne. Beyond that, what I'm curious about is, who are you? What brought you into the world of philanthropy? What are some personal values and practices that hold you on this journey of being a philanthropist, funder, program officer, resource generator, however you identify yourself? So I'm going to repeat that. Who are you? What brought you to the world of philanthropy? What are some personal values and practices that hold you on this journey of being who you are? If you can each take about 3 minutes to respond to that question, then we can go into the second round of questions and third round, all very short questions like this, and then we can also engage with the participants. Is that okay? Are the questions okay? All right, floor is all yours.
Okay, I'll dive in. Hello, thank you, Noel. And thank you, Center for Livable Future. What brought me into philanthropy? I'd say family. It's a family foundation. So family relationships brought me in. And at the start, what grounded me first in my philanthropic work was funding these federal nutrition policy anchor organizations, such as Food Research Action Center, FRAC, and Center for Science in the Public Interest. Those groups that are, essential to the federal food policy space, and a safe bet. So that's where I started. And honestly, they're the places I interned, or worked or were involved with earlier in my career in public health and in anti-hunger work. I have a personal inclination towards politics, and democracy and civic engagement. I don't know where that came from or how to explain it. It's just what lights a fire in me. I'm a political science undergraduate major, for what that's worth. Specifically, what brought me into this more participatory grant making would be conversations, relationships, listening, more conversations, more listening, and a way to apply the personal values of civic empowerment, politics, and policy in this philanthropic work that family relationships landed me in. That's where I'll stop for now.
Thank you, Jen.
I'll be happy to go next. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for asking me to be part of this conversation. Who am I? I'm actually a product of the safety net of the United States. So when you think of every safety net program, I probably have benefited somehow, and now have the privilege of sitting as the president and CEO of the California Endowment. And I named the safety net piece because that at the core is what has motivated me in my career in health, in policy, and in philanthropy. What brought me to this work? I had started out as a community organizer and working in nonprofit policy and advocacy space in the health space. And as someone that had been in that work, got an opportunity to come to philanthropy. And my belief was that philanthropy needed to have different kinds of voices at the time. And this was about 20 years ago. People that had more practice of actually coming from the nonprofit sector into the philanthropic space. Values that drive me are a deep, deep sense of community, and that community knows best. And that actually is how I got started on my journey of what I describe as flipping philanthropy on its head and trying to bend the power dynamic and really, truly put community at the center. I'll leave it there because I'm sure we're going to have a little bit more conversation.
Thanks, Brenda. Jed.
Yeah, thanks, Noel. Appreciate being in this space and with you as always. What brought me into this work, and so I have some notes here because otherwise I would probably ramble too much. But I actually came into the philanthropy work through my work doing youth justice and education justice work in Mississippi in the Deep South. And most directly, I would say, was the community that I built relationship with through love and trust and all the other pieces of it that actually put me in philanthropy, because I didn't go looking for philanthropy, really wasn't even quite sure what it was, even as I saw it around me in terms of like the investments and whatnot. And I got a call from the Kellogg Foundation, which had a place-based office in Mississippi at the time, still does, in Mississippi, to recruit me as a program officer. And I was like, what the heck is this? I don't know what this is, but folks from the community had recommended me. And so eventually I was hired for that position as a program officer. I moved to Mississippi in 2008 and spent and have just left and now live in DC. But I'm a child of California. I live in DC. I lived many years outside of the country. And I think until somebody has lived and worked and or is from Mississippi, they can't really understand America anywhere. And at any time in our history, including right now and in the future. And so I think that was the biggest link between love of community and love of place and love of people, and the work that I was then asked to do to learn about food systems, which I've not really ever thought of. But when I thought about the fact that a lot of my work was in the back of jails and prisons where young people were being warehoused, and thinking about the links back into the community, it was not a far stretch to think about something like food systems and the various other things that I'm sure will come up today in terms of how we think about our relationships in philanthropy and how we think about the kind of justice in which we intend to do and hope to do, even as Noel mentioned, we don't often do well.
Thank you all so much. So much to think about based on the way each of you have offered us where you come from. And that's a question I often sit with, right? Which is, where am I from? Who am I? What brings me? What keeps me? What motivates me? And the second round of questions I'm thinking about for you is, each of you have been associated. You are here because there's something we've been inspired by, the way you are doing philanthropy, the way you have been in philanthropy. And each of you have been part of this work. And as I just heard you say, choosing to operate through the practice of your own personal values. And that is extremely important to think about right now, or even ever, right? How do you continue to move at the speed of values alignment, trust with community, because that is extremely important, and how you build up the strength of relationships and change the dynamics of power. So my question is, why and how does your values and your approach matter? Why and how have they mattered so far? And why will they matter in the context of where we are and what we are walking into, right? And then what did that make possible for you and for your communities so far? and what's in the way of doing equity, justice, and sustainable development centered power building work in philanthropy. So whether you want to talk about the high points or pain points, or give us story-based examples, however you feel comfortable to do this, I can repeat the questions again. How does your approach matter? Why does it matter? What did being value-centered make possible for you, make possible for the change work in your communities? And what's in the way of philanthropy centering equity, justice, and sustainable development? High points, pain points, in between, whatever you want to offer us. And whoever wants to go, start us off.
All right, I'll jump in. We'll go the other direction maybe this time. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's complicated, and I know we have only 20, 25, 30, 40 minutes. So I'll try to be as brief as possible and try to address some of these. I think through my experiences working in food systems and my previous role at Kellogg, which, by the way, I do not speak on the behalf of. I just also want to make clear. So the foundation had been doing some very smallish grant making around food systems for many decades, including with some investments in Mississippi. And when I took over, I didn't take over, when I became a program officer in the Mississippi office, frankly, they just needed somebody to manage some of the food systems grants that were kind of running short on time, and the organization was doing a new strategic plan. It wasn't clear where all of these were going to fit in, and so I just needed to, for the most part, tie them off and close them out. But I also didn't know anything about like food systems and what that actually meant. So I spent a lot of time learning, and the first place I went to was the community that I knew, that I had built relationships with, folks like Noel and Liz, her colleague, who I used to work with, the folks in Choctaw, and so many other folks around the state who I knew had some sense of what was going on with how food systems work or don't work within Mississippi, and how they're equitable or not. And so I dug right in with the learning. One of the things that was very clear, that where mission of foundation versus mission of community was not very well aligned at the time, was there had been support for the statewide food policy council, which had been mostly older white folks, academic folks, who were not community based, who didn't really understand what it was like not to be able to feed their families in the evening times, or not to have schools that would provide the free lunches that are so necessary in order to sustain our children's nutrition and whatnot. And through conversations with folks like Noel and some of the other folks, it became very clear where we needed to support kind of the re-envisioning both of the Food Policy Council, but then with the food systems work, and to listen and to use my leverage or use my positionality, whatever the term is, within the foundation world, to kind of move my own organization back in that direction, where it wasn't so academic focused, white centered focus of what justice means, and actually justice centered around what community interprets it to mean. And so that took a lot of work, and it took years of kind of changing that and thinking about that within the Mississippi context. I think the Choctaw is another good example of this. When our strategy said work with the local indigenous communities, and there was pushback from my leadership when I actually said, okay, I'm building relationships with the local community. Being a very output-oriented organization, my supervisor wanted us to do a jobs program with the Choctaw without ever having talked to the Choctaw about a jobs program. And so we through building relationships with folks from the Choctaw who were bringing forth the Choctaw fresh produce, which grew mostly organic, local traditional foods, we decided to support them in terms of their efforts to kind of keep on doing that. So, the values were very, very clear to me. Listen, create a space for real dialogues around the work that needed to be done. But then also, like, how do you move a large institution, even if it's just a small segment of that large institution, in a way to shift our practices? And so that was not easy, and that is not easy in terms of the philanthropic approach. One of the things that I remember hearing at a conference is many years ago when I first started in philanthropy, is that most foundations are just investment firms that do grant making on the side. So it's not just a question of how we make our grants, but also how we push the other levers within the foundation. And so through listening and aligning those values, listening to our folks in Mississippi who are working around reparations, land back, heirs property. I can never say heirs correctly. Heirs property, other things that weren't intuitively food systems, but absolutely are about food systems. When the pandemic hit and we started talking about disruptions in access to quality food, when the ICE raid happened in 2019 under the past and future president, we started to think about, well, you know, what's the immigrant labor like in Mississippi? How is that related to food systems? What do we need to be doing to support the folks who are advocating on the behalf of the laborers too, right? And so bringing all of that in under this rupture of society and what was happening in Mississippi all became food systems work. So I'll stop there. That was a little bit of a ramble, even with my notes. I apologize.
Thank you, Jed.
I'm happy to go next since we're going in reverse order from the previous question. So when I was in the nonprofit sector, I would chase dollars. I would turn the organization and the work that we were doing into pretzels in order to make the case for why I fit an foundation's giving program. And then when I joined foundations, I realized that I was a translator, and I helped the pretzel making, the sausage making probably is a better description, of convincing folks internally why we should fund, and went through various, at the different foundations that I worked in various ways of review and approval that were highly bureaucratic, that were very top down, that were very much controlled by folks at the foundations that were really at the top of the organizations. And when a grant finally got made, from my perspective, there was very little value add of all the rigmarole, is what I call it, that happened inside of the foundation. And I kept asking myself, why don't we just write the checks to the people that are doing good work? At one point, I was going to leave philanthropy because I fundamentally think it's a broken system. And then had an opportunity to go to Montana and start up a new foundation. And the vision was, what if we did it differently? What if we threw out every playbook that foundations utilize to make grants? And we eliminated levels of bureaucracy. We automated things. We put community at the center. We let community define what our strategic focus should be. We let community decide who we should fund. We did multi-year general operating grants to the organizations that were doing the work that they thought they needed to do. And we shifted from grant makers to really being in partnership and relationship with communities. That radically changed the relationship that we had at Headwaters with the grantees that were our partners, really, and came to us with all kinds of issues and requests. And so the paradigm shifted from one of this power dynamic to one of being in trusting relationships. I did that work, and it's been some of the most inspirational work that I've done in terms of the partnerships that we will be able to build. I saw little grants make tremendous impact in communities that were allowed to define the issues and the solutions to the work that they needed to do. And I really shifted the paradigm of the board is in charge and makes decisions, or the CEO or the executives, to really it is the folks on the ground. When I speak about this work across the country, I was often told, well, you got to do that because you were small, or you were startup, or you were in Montana, or there was lots of different excuses. And I actually think that philanthropy uses those excuses because it doesn't actually want to get out of the way. It doesn't want to cede the power. to communities. So I was lucky enough to get recruited to run the California Endowment, and my vision is to take what we did at Headwaters and scale it at the endowment so we can actually demonstrate to the field that if you are a values driven organization, if you truly believe in centering community, if you really believe that grantee partners are the ones on the ground that know what the challenges are and what the solutions are, and you facilitate and you expedite and you make simple and you don't complicate the process of securing funds for a foundation, that's when true transformation is going to be able to happen. I did not start out by saying that I was going to create a trust-based foundation. It sort of has grown over the last 3 years due to the pandemic, the social reckoning, and some of the other issues that created an opening for this approach to take off. But I do think that many of us who have practiced this way have seen the value of really flipping the power dynamic. And I am truly excited when I see the work that's happening across this country by other foundations that are following similar approaches, and really empowering communities, empowering nonprofits, and getting out of the way, which is, from my perspective, what trust-based philanthropy is about.
Thank you, Brenda. Jen.
Hi, thanks. Briefly going back to your first question, I was looking in the chat and I saw a mention of the food project, which brought me back to my, I don't know, 19, 20-year-old self. That in fact was went to Tufts, was my, I think my first internship. So that's a nice memory of kind of how this pathway, where it started. The seed was planted with the food project. So shout out, hi there. So how we approach, so I referenced briefly anchoring these anti-hunger policy organizations, and that remains motivating. But I think what I want to talk more here and now is about the Better Food Policy Fund, which didn't have that title at the beginning because it was co-developed and it was not a donor-led or donor-driven process to get to this, what is this food policy, Better Food Policy Fund? Well, fast forward to how we define it now, it's a values-based fund to support local, regional, or tribal groups who are working in the US to effect better food policy through civic collaboration. Each word matters, so that's why I said it kind of slowly. So how did it start? Well, I said sort of the value of conversations and relationships and listening to people I trust. You know, how perhaps could funding that we're bringing to the table advance these civic collaborations and empower food democracy? How, where? And listening to people. Was listening to people such as Ann Palmer and Karen at the Center for Livable Future, listening to people like Peter Lurie and Jane Welna at CSPI, but then turning to the nitty-gritty and the philanthropic reality of how to set up that fund, where to park that money, and how to make sure that that money is governed and processed in a certain way. So reaching out to a longtime partner in philanthropy at the Tides Foundation, a social justice motivated philanthropic partner, to set up something that isn't a DAF, which many of us are familiar with, but a CAF, a collective action fund. And written into the fine print that you sign as you start a CAF is that it's not donor driven. So in its, and how we chose to express it is signing over power of decision making and how money gets doled out right from the outstart. And so then handing that to what will become an independent advisory council or an IAC. So all of this, thanks, Allie, you can read so much more and even listen to a narrated voice note that our process consultant, Christy Scheide, created. You'll see it's quite a long process because these things can't and shouldn't be rushed, right? So that was one thing personally I learned. I'm like, rush, the money's there, let's get it out. The need is great, hurry up. So checking myself and that need for results and the feeling of being a responsible philanthropist, right? Get it out. But so no, check that. Have more conversations. Have a landscape analysis. Devolve power to those who know a lot more. Build relationship. Build relationship. And this has been by far the most personally satisfying effort in my whole career, has been being part of, and kind of a small part of, right, the Better Food Policy Fund. It's been so satisfying. So what's a high point of this approach and my involvement? It would be the point where you step back as a donor. I thought deep inside, I think that might be uncomfortable. I didn't want to admit it even to myself, right? It wasn't. It was satisfying, and it wasn't scary at all, because we had built trust, because we had these strong governance processes. And I think we all felt comfortable. It wasn't about, oh, let's make the donor feel okay with this deeply participatory process. It wasn't. We all needed to feel comfortable, and I think we all got there. And a lot of that has to do with a good process consultant who built a really inclusive process that was transparent. So folks knew who's involved, when, how to get involved again, how to get their voice heard and listened to, and why decisions were being made and how decisions were being made. So it was a very open, we endeavored to make it a very open process. Maybe low points, I don't know, might be, it's intensive, right? It expects a lot of everyone, especially the advanced team who sort of set a strategic priority, and the independent advisory IAC. It's time intensive, reading things, attending meetings, and you are going, folks who were asking to be involved are going nonstop and over the top for their own nonprofits, for their own networks, trying to raise money, trying to write their own ships. And then we ask an additional effort, while compensated, still there's only so many hours in a day. So I don't know if that's a low point. I'll let those folks talk for themselves, but it's tough. I don't know that participatory grant making is the answer for everything, because then all the folks we're asking to do the work, we're also asking them to do all the philanthropic work, because there's work and time involved. So that's something I chew on, but it's been a fantastic experience.
Thank you for that, Jen. Thanks to all three of you, Brenda, Jed, and Jen, for sharing and responding to that question from your personal experiences. And I'm sitting with what you all said. One of the things all three of you mentioned is the relationship work. And when you mention relationships, to me, they're like, I'm thinking about the relationship you have with yourself that may have shifted as you grew through this process, right? Because this is a different kind of work that each of you are doing. There's a lot of learning coming towards you that will be impacting you. I'm wondering about that. What kind of, how did it impact you personally in your relationship to yourself, doing this kind of work where you're actually impacting change in a very unique way? And then the relationship with the people you work with, and the relationship to community, and your relationship to power, right? These are all the ways in which I'm trying to understand relationships. So if you have any thoughts on that, that I would love to hear that. And I'm also thinking each of you in your own way have become cultural change makers, because you're thinking about culture within the organization and creating a new culture of work, right? And a culture of philanthropy. So I'm thinking about that too. And then structural changes. I don't know how you were able to help your own people contend with the structural changes that came along with this kind of imagination and doing, and then the internal policy work. So these are the ways, like thinking about the relationships, I'm thinking about culture, I'm thinking about structure and policy. If you have any thoughts on that, we can start with Brenda, actually, and go around. And thank you all again.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're naming relationships, structure, and then culture, and then structural changes. Because when I think about what we were able to do at Headwaters, it really was across those three things. So first thing I'll say is, working in philanthropy in a traditional model is not really fun. It's bureaucratic and tedious, and very power and ego driven. The changes we made in terms of developing real relationships with our grantees allowed us to be in a more joyous space with them, in a more open and trusting space with them. So it was a lot more fulfilling to be in that kind of relationship than in the traditional role. It also created for some real transparent conversations that allowed me as an individual and the team that I was leading to grow. There were several of our grantee partners that came to me and gave us very constructive, candid feedback that I had never heard as a program person in any other foundation I worked at. And that allowed us to become better at the way that we were interacting with community and our grantee partners. So just fundamentally change relationship, and then transparency, and then build trust. I think the other thing is when your culture inside your foundation is one of trust and psychological safety and transparency, it allows you to operate very differently in the external work. And so there was intentionality of building the internal culture that was required to improve the way that we were interacting with our grantee partners. And then structurally, it required us to reimagine what the board role was, what the program staff role, what, sort of the bureaucratic, administrative, legal functions were. And the way that we did that was to demonstrate to those folks in those positions that generally don't approach a community-driven way of doing the work, inviting them into a values conversation and using the values lenses to make decisions and operate the foundation versus the compliance measures or the power or bureaucracy measures or lenses that foundations tend to use. And so when we started to shift from your job is not just the compliance or the legal or the structural, but rather the mission of the foundation, the values and the relationship and what our grantees are starting to say, then it opened up possibilities with those individuals to think about the work radically different. The other thing is, we've had to bring people with different kinds of perspectives into the work. So traditionally, philanthropy has hired experts, right? Experts in food, experts in health. And we ended up hiring a lot of folks that were generalists, which allowed our team to more open and be willing to listen to community. And so that was also part of shifting the way that who was the expert in the room and how do you build the relationships to allow communities to really be in the lead. And then the hard thing is always the board, right? The board or the family that really want to be able to make sure that they're having an impact, or that communities are doing what the foundation wants it to do. And I think that was the hardest part at Headwaters, was to shift the paradigm of the board. But when we started with little things, and when the board started to see success and the impact that it was having, then they were more willing to take bigger steps to transition sort of their role and let go of some of the power that they didn't even realize they had. So for me, it's these three things are really interconnected, and the shift to a different way of practicing needs to address all three of those. And all of them are rooted in relationship. So that's why, when I think about trust-based philanthropy, I'm not thinking about just the practices of simplifying grant making or providing multi-year general operating support. It's about the values-driven approach that looks at structure, leadership, and values, really.
Thanks, Brenda. Jed?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Gosh, I think all of the above were very difficult. When I came to Kellogg, I was new to the sector of philanthropy. I was new to most of the issues I was being asked to work on. I was new to the role as a program officer and what that meant. And so there was a lot of learning I had to do. But I came in because of the relationships I had, and I always centered that. Like I said, like it was the community that recommended me for this position, and so it was the community in which I centered in everything that I figured out how to do while I was in philanthropy and still do, for a different foundation. And so that took a lot of saying to people, hey, as appropriate, invite me to your learning spaces, or invite me to whatever, while also recognizing quickly that there's always a power dynamic when somebody from philanthropy steps into the room, particularly in a place like Mississippi, where an organization like Kellogg has an outsized presence of an overwhelming presence in terms of funding in a state like Mississippi. But still, it was also those relationships that I think changed some of the dynamics that I dealt with. In that, I think because of that power dynamic that is so present between philanthropy and community, because I came from the community into philanthropy, Noel could call me up and tell me when I was bullshitting, right? Like when I was like, that's not you, Jed, whatever, public thing I just had to do, or whatever, or Nishambi could call me up and say that's BS, or like all the people who raised me up as an advocate, as somebody doing the work, could call me up and say, that's not legit. Like, also tell me what's going on internally that we could provide cover for you too, right? In terms of the kinds of things that we needed to be able to push on the inside of the foundation or on the outside of the foundation too. And that all comes from relationships and trust, and not being offended if Noel or anybody else calls me up and says, what you doing? And it still happens. It's great. And so I think that kind of dynamic is vital. It's paramount. If you can't be held accountable, both to yourself and to your community, and you get enough of or the philanthropic ego of everything always being so nice and pretty all the time, like, if you can't be held accountable, then you shouldn't be in the role that you are in, and potentially go find something else to do. And like thinking about that, and thinking that all came from my learning from the community in which I chose to live and spent 15 years in, being pushed, pulled, and tugged, and loved and hated, and all of the above, right? And that, I think, it kind of connects back to the structure and power internally, because I also saw myself as a translator a lot. We were an office in Mississippi, but we were part of a national foundation. And so a lot of the times we had to translate like what was happening in our community to either the national org, or various hired like consultants or whomever was like trying to help with strategy and development and all this kind of stuff. But I saw myself as a translator, and I think it was in that translator role where I could say to the community that I was working with when I was making leadership development grants, these are internally leadership development, but they were all power building grants, right? It was supporting Black, Brown, and Indigenous leaders to do the things that they needed to do through general operations, et cetera, et cetera. But our internal language was leadership development. So it's like, how do you figure that out and then provide the cues to our partners to be able to work with that? And I think that's all relationships. That's all understanding the power structures, and it's also understanding, like a comment I said a moment ago, that the grant making is only part of the power of foundations, right? Like, how do you work with grassroots partners to start asking for endowment dollars for their organizations, right? Like, how do like, you're going to get no most of the time, but it forces a conversation, right? It forces like the foundation or whomever to think differently about practices, or how do you get some of your local partners into the investment part of the conversation at the foundation or whatever foundation? Like, those are much harder structural issues but the more that they're raised, hopefully, potentially, if the organization itself, the foundation itself is saying it's community centered, then that's what they will do. And that's what they should do. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jed. Jen.
Okay, I'm trying to remind myself of the original question, so if I go off, just redirect me. But I think you were asking about sort of, it was a deeply personal, reflection. Okay, personally, I have to agree, Brenda has brought up so many good points, but one in particular, how does it make you feel, like the traditional philanthropy versus this participatory trust-based? I agree, it feels better, it's more engaging, it's more sparkly, so it sparkles. It makes you want to come back to your computer to do Zooms. You sometimes look forward to Zooms because you're with these working in community with these interesting people. So you want to engage. So from the donor perspective, it's more fulfilling. And that's not, the reason to do it, how it makes me feel. I'm just saying how it does make me feel, which is positive. It's a positive thing. It feels better to be less bureaucratic. It feels better to consult with people who know so much more, have different perspectives. So there's that. So adhering to a few core values. So when you get a little bit lost in the participatory grant making, where is this going and when's it going to get there? Coming back to those core values that were set. And for us at the Better Food Policy Fund, it's been, among others, dance with complexity. So then you can just take a deep breath when it all feels like, where is this going? We got to dance with this complexity because food system work is complex. So dance with that. We're okay with that. Also, celebrating abundance. That's a great value to keep in mind as a donor, and thinking about how you're going to eventually attract other donors is coming in with this mindset of abundance, while not taking funds from food policy councils who are barely getting by. The average is less than $10,000 budgets of these food policy councils. So celebrating abundance while also being aware of not trying to siphon off any monies from current food policy groups. One thing, a culture shift, I don't know, because it's a really small shop at the From Now On Fund. So I'm waiting to see what culture shifts this Better Food Policy Fund. So the From Now On Fund is a seed donor for the Better Food Policy Fund. Waiting to see what kind of culture shifts are rippling out among funders. Funders in the food space come in with their own well thought out portfolios. They're not, as far as I could tell, so far not jumping. We're tripping over ourselves to fund this Better Food Policy Fund, because they already have strategic goals and well thought out plans. And so seeing how this ripples out, and then gaining a little bit more confidence as the first round of grants have gone out just in the past few months, seeing where this goes, seeing what storytelling and stories can emerge from these food policy councils and their leaders. And then maybe using that as a springboard to ripple out, to attract more funding, to attract a shifted funding paradigm towards more projects that will look like the Better Food Policy Fund. In that, a specific example could be how exactly the governance, how were funds given out in the celebrating abundance spirit. Once these food policy groups met a certain criteria, is essentially a lottery. Everyone deserves to be celebrated. You're all doing fantastic work. And it's not us, the IAC, to pick and choose with your powerful wand who gets the money. So it was essentially, at some point, a lottery that reflected an interest in diversity, geographic and various types of diversity and inclusion in the group of grantees. Essentially, it was a lottery, picking out of a hat. So we'll see the culture shift. I'm curious where it goes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, everything that you all have said kept me wondering again about how, your emotional, intellectual, cultural health as leaders and doers, how, because of the relational, cultural, structure, and policy work you have done, has informed and impacted your institutions and continues to impact and inform community and change, right? I'm thinking about that, want to honor what you all have done so far. And the last question from me, and this is a question for everybody on the webinar today, actually. Close your eyes, everyone, and then if you can imagine, we're going to go into an imagination right now. We want to practice radical imagination. There's an abundant, magical flow of resources that is happening. Abundant flow of resources in the context of a lot of complexity and bad policy at various levels. And when you have this abundance of resources, and resources are not just monies, right? Resources are your brilliance. Resources are access to relationships. Resources are access to cultural wisdom, knowledge. Resources are access to spaces like institutions and infrastructure, and access to some good policy. Imagine you have access to all those resources, plus tons of money and other people that you see as important in this work. So now, can you imagine what kind of a philanthropic space for food systems that you can build? If you can build an amazing food system space, amazing philanthropic space that funds food system work to transform regional economies, what would it look like? What approach will you go by to pick the folk who you can steward it with? And how will you provide your lessons along the way to reshape philanthropy in general? Imagine you have access to tons of resources and you have the opportunity to build a philanthropic space that will support the transformation of food systems and regional economies. What would it look like? What approach you will use to pick the folk you can steward it with? How will you inform and transform philanthropy in general? Participants, please, 1 minute, Jen. Participants, please share your imaginaries in chat. I wish we could all be in one place, in person, having this conversation and doing this exercise of radical imagination. This is how we do in Mississippi. We look at the past, we timeline, and then we do radical imagination of our future for the next 200 years. That's what we have been doing for a while. And then there's a beautiful exercise we have created for ourselves. Jed has been a part of it, and Anne has borne witness to it too. And so just creating this way in which we can imagine what we want to make possible, right? And doing it together. Each and every one of you talked about participatory, listening to community. So I'm asking this question: what would that beautiful new space could look like? So Jane, you came off mic if you want to start, and we can go around however.
I was imagining I had this specific vision of some place, maybe it's on a website, where it's all clear who is funding what and where. And it's just very easy to access information, to have a sense of what's going on in food system philanthropy. If that exists, you all can tell me. But I would like to know, even as a donor, you feel a little bit isolated. Who's doing what? How can I get access to information? So I think it would have to start this dream radical thing of radical information, radical transparency, and in a very simple and accessible way.
I'm going to build that off of that and say radical access. By that is, could the food system be, we're thinking about it in radically different ways in terms of who has access to it, who has access to funding, who has access to power, who has access to decision making. And I have to say that thank you for creating this space, Noel, for us to reimagine, because that's often what I tell folks when they're talking about, like, how do I change my foundation? How do I change my approach? And what are best practices? And if you just create the space to do this reimagination, that's where we as individuals, no matter where you sit in your organization, have the possibility to bring transformation to the work.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Brenda. Absolutely, yes. Jed, we've been dreaming and building a lot together, so go for it.
Yeah. So philanthropy is not going to solve this. And I think a couple of the things, what philanthropy I think is good for is catalyzing ideas and catalyzing the imagination. And so one, I'd want to fund, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 advocates in Mississippi or wherever to build and sustain. I'd spend down the endowment focused on that. And really it's about, with, I don't know, some of our endowments that could just fund people's livelihoods for a number of years, regardless of what they decide their livelihood is. And then I think in terms of regional economies, like I'll actually use an example from my time on the school board, actually in Jackson. And and I wouldn't have thought about this if I hadn't been working my philanthropy job with folks like Noel and others, Gloria Dickerson up in Drew talking about food. This wouldn't have occurred to me if I hadn't learned from them and then brought that into my school board experience, where we had a, I don't know, $300 million budget every year, the second largest district in Mississippi. And our food policy, like our own internal thing, our vending contracts, right? Like had no geographic distance that the food and the products could come from. And I was like, well, if we could change that to I don't know, a 20-mile radius of the city of Jackson, that being the largest government entity in the region would have completely shifted how and who local Black farmers, local Indigenous farmers would have been able to access the market that the school district could have provided. It would have shifted the state of Mississippi's on their contracting. I was unsuccessful, but still, it's like, how do you think more like nuts and bolts like that? And then also having been lucky enough sometimes to work in the philanthropic space, be like, well, we could also fund the 5,000 advocates to go out there who might have their own land, who might be already impacted by the fact that 90% of all of agricultural product in Mississippi leaves the state, and that 90% of the money goes to white hands in Mississippi. I think it's more in the food systems work in terms of corporate and white-owned farms and plantations still. So how do we think about that? And I think those are the things that I'd want to reimagine and use philanthropic money to be able to do.
Thank you all. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for this beautiful time together. If just waiting on questions to come through or imaginaries, as you can see in chat, people have been sharing their ways of imagining what could be good for their people and themselves, right? Yeah, there's one more thing. Water, commerce, and electricity have to come to the table as part of the resources needed to make urban ag viable. Yes, absolutely. Please keep sharing your ideas and what you're prioritizing and dreaming about. Those of us who have the privilege of having an analysis of power, where we are able to see race, class, gender, culture, and other forms in which we engage with power together, right? We have that privilege of understanding it. That privilege can also allow us to continue to be stretched and sharpened, stretched to sharpen our analysis of power based on where we are. Because a lot of times, some regions in the country are left out of the conversation, and there isn't practices of equities depending upon where we are, right? And so as those of us who are from the Deep South, having experienced inequity within the ways in which we have been funded, and to have allies such as Jed, you know, when I have to describe Jed, this is my moment to honor you and thank each of you, but also particularly, you know, the relationships that made me come into this work, right? As questions come in, I'm trying to do that too. You know, Jed is somebody whose family, Jed is someone I marched the streets with, done organizing work and advocacy work with, and someone I continue to dream without dreaming. Relationship has always included dreaming of possibilities and acting on those dreams, whether it's doing work around public education, or it is about working on food systems, immigrant justice, or take the range of whatever issues are impacting our people in Mississippi and the rest of the world. So thank you, Jed, for being here, for being an ally, for being a friend and a thought partner. Thank you for that. Brenda, you know, reading about your work and getting to see what you made possible. And I just love the title, Headwaters. One of my friends who is from Louisiana, she worked on a project from Headwaters of Mississippi. So there's a connection to the title of the work that you have done for me, but also thank you so much for how you have continued to shape philanthropy. And Jane, thank you for the work you're doing, building what you're building. And and Anne, Karen, and Ali, thank you for holding space for all of us to come together to have these conversations. Yeah.
May I jump in? There's a good question in the Q&A.
Yes, go for it.
What role do lawyers, legal services, food justice? I'm interested, and I'm wondering how many others, you know, I think many of us are like-minded in advancing the right to food and supporting legal services and advocacy that advances the right to food. It's an organizing concept as well as an end goal to see right to food enshrined in various ways. So I definitely see a role for lawyers and legal services. And it's a priority for this funder. There is a right to food community of practice.
Yeah, Allison is actually on the call with
hi,
us.
Allison.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, but I don't have an answer to that. I'm sure there's a role for lawyers and legal work. What I will say in a place like Mississippi in the Deep South is the land is twice stolen from the indigenous communities and then from the Black communities thereafter. And so, like, you know, are there creative legal challenges to get land back? Are there creative legal challenges to do that and figure that out? Like, that's something to think about from a legal perspective.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. That was also one of the considerations we were holding when the ICE raids happened, right, Jed? Like, what are the ways in which we understand labor and built-in protections and understand the culture of how labor is being brought into Mississippi when you think about a food pipeline, like fruit production to procurement pipelines. That was a consideration. There's a question from Nessa in chat. I'm wondering how philanthropy can intentionally support civic engagement with writ large using a food systems lens. Thanks, Nessa, for the question. Anyone wants to take on that question?
Well, I think I may have kind of started to say that in terms of the dreaming space, right? Like what philanthropy can do outside of running funding programs is the systems change work that does come from general operations costs, unrestricted funds. but then also like building advocates, right? What the Center for Food Systems is doing in Mississippi is they are building advocates all over the state. They're talking to USDA, they're talking to the state DA, I forget what it's called, MSDA, whatever it's called. And they are pushing big P policy, but also small P policy, which we often forget because we're so focused on what's happening in the legislature. But there's actually a lot of stuff that could be happening administratively, or like I mentioned, at school boards and whatnot. And so I think funding the advocates to do the advocacy, to support them, and not ask questions and say, how soon can you get me something, right? That's what philanthropy needs. Somebody mentioned philanthropy needs to step back sometimes. Like, don't be so output focused, right? Push philanthropy not to be short-term focused. I mean, big P and small P policy take often generations, hopefully not that long, 3, 4, 5 year cycles to be able to move something. And that's what philanthropy could do, fund the advocates.
Absolutely agree on that. I think in each of our ecosystems, again, bearing witness to the work we are doing in Mississippi, thanks, Jed, for bringing that up. We are investing long-term in individuals who are leaders of our food systems work. So the individuals can be artists, cultural workers, farmers, to lawyers, to teachers, to anything, as long as they're committed to change and they believe food systems is a way of thinking through and engaging in change work. That's who we are investing in. That's 20 of them across the state of Mississippi who we've had in our fellowship/leadership program for the past 5 years. No one has left. And that's important to recognize also how people continue to be there, because relationship is the foundation of how we do this work, and cultural work happens to be how we are continuing to hold each other by centering relationships, care, well-being, and culture at the core of how we think about structural change and policy change work, investing in individuals, investing in institutions, and then building the infrastructure we all need and deserve. So those are the 3 ways in which we are doing the work in Mississippi. I'm here because of Mississippi. I'm asked to be on this panel as a moderator because of Mississippi. So I have to say that in closing, and thank you all again for being here. This has been amazing, and turning it back over to Anne.
Brenda, Jed, and Jane, thank you so much for spending time with us today. This was really amazing and very inspiring, and definitely a great reminder that democracy is alive and well in spite of election results, that we have a lot of work to do, and there's some great people to be doing that work with. And I want to give a special thanks to Noel for facilitating the discussion once again. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions and just the energy you dedicate to the work you do. It's been a real pleasure to have you as a partner in this work. So I think we are at 3:15, ending on time. And thanks again to everybody who joined us.
Thanks, everyone. Continue to take good care of yourself.